India for arranging this talk. I was described as an amazing speaker. I don't know whether that's meant to be how amazing the speaker is or how amazing it is that he is a speaker. It's like this: how does India manage the multiple challenges of dealing with its energy crisis and increasing its economic growth while maintaining strategic autonomy and also being environmentally responsible? The short answer is that it doesn't. It doesn't manage. The longer answer, which will take me the next 30 or 35 minutes, that it can try and it will try. And I start with the caveat that I speak as a generalist and not as an economist or a specialist. It is said that, there's a joke about economists. The man was interviewing 3 people for a job. The first was a mathematician, so he asked him, what's 2 plus 2? So he said, all theories say that 2 plus 2 is 4. The second was a statistician, and he said, it's less than 5 and it's more than the 3. The probability is that it is 4. The third person who came in was an economist. So he asked him the same question. That chap got up and closed the door, came back and sat down and said, sir, what would you like it to be? So in addressing this issue, we need to recognize that India is perhaps the world's first major economy in human history, trying to achieve 3 energy goals simultaneously. The first is to end energy poverty and provide affordable energy access to over 1 billion people. Second, to do this while exercising, quote, planetary responsibility, unquote, which is an accelerated transition to cleaner energy and decarbonization. And 3, to do it while maximizing energy self-sufficiency and being cognizant of energy security. No other large country has had to do all 3 at the same time. We can discuss later, if required, the experience of China or the USA or Russia or the European countries and their massive contribution to global emissions, to pollution, to exploitation of other people's resources, the energy wars, etc. Now, energy poverty is India's energy crisis, albeit it's an ongoing one and not always spoken of as a crisis. In the whole world, there are estimated 1.3 billion people who rely on basic biomass, that is wood, crop wastes, charcoal, and even dung, to burn it for cooking or staying alive. About 250 million of these are in India. And when kerosene and LPG prices go up, this goes up to 300 to 400 million. With 18% of the world's population, we consume only 6% of global primary energy. Now, our targeted economic growth will, we say, raise this to at least 11% by 2040, and the IEA endorses this, which means doubling our share of global consumption even while the rest of the world is also growing. And I think this is the least we owe to ourselves as Indians. India will have the world's largest population perhaps by the end of this year, and will be the 3rd largest economy by 2030. But our national target of economic growth is to become a developed nation by 2047, which is something else from being 3rd largest. It means agriculture must be modern with a less human load. We need a shift in manufacturing, possibly trying to be a global hub with greater exports. You need advanced service sectors beyond the IT traditional one. You need quality and affordable healthcare and education. And you need modern infrastructure and efficient logistics, which means energy, energy, energy. Otherwise, economic growth will slow, if not stall. In 1920 or thereabouts, Lenin, when talking about the new economic plan when the Soviet Union was embarking on its what he thought was a great adventure, he was once asked to sum up those tomes of energy and industrial growth plans and the new economic plan. And he finally said, it boils down to 2 words, electrificia, electrificia. Communism means electricity. Adequacy of energy means domestic energy production and use has to expand more rapidly and with greater reliance on domestic resources than ever done in our history. Simply put, we have to use every source of commercial energy that is available, and that is my view. Why? Because both the domestic and the global contexts will become ever more challenging, with access to resources being a primary challenge. The global context is shifting from globalization and offshoring of economies towards increased competition, conflict, and concomitant shift towards self-reliance, or at best, friend-shoring. And energy is now a weapon of competition, perhaps a weapon of war. So the domestic context needs to change if we want strategic autonomy and remain independent. The historical experience shows that this is a lesson we are learning, but learning very slowly. Energy self-reliance, or at least taking recourse to domestically available resources, has indeed been the aim from the time of independence. Our first Prime Minister who stepped up hydropower and laid the foundation for nuclear energy. In the first 3 or 4 decades of independence, we expanded coal production, we built up an oil industry, we started gas, and we created the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. We were coal producers and oil importers, but in an era of slow economic growth, energy demand also grew relatively slowly. And we learned to live with constant energy problems. Load shedding became part of the English language for most of us when we were growing up. We were hit hard by the oil price crisis of the 1970s and went through a great period of austerity. Perhaps even the emergency was linked to it. Till the 1980s, when the Bombay High oil field provided some relief for us on the oil front. However, we did not actually face a crisis till 1990, after energy supply failed to keep up with economic growth for almost half a decade. There is one other period where we did face a problem which is not much written about, and someday I hope to dig into the archives, and that is in 1971. When we were at war, there was a serious worry, not about crude oil, but about refined oil products being available at short notice. Fortunately, our armed forces had built up their stocks. But one significant thing happened. Shortly after the war, the nationalization of the 2 American refineries, that process began. So I think that should tell you what the problem was. The real first crisis begins in 1990. And I relate the financial crisis of 1991 to the oil crisis of 1990. And I'll tell you why, because I was in Iran and I was a first-hand witness to this. I happened to take charge of the embassy as a youngish 39-year-old. Nowadays, people become vice presidents at 34, apparently. But the next day, Saddam Hussein marched into Kuwait and all hell broke loose in the Gulf. Within a few weeks, it was clear that war was coming. And within a few weeks of that war looming, shipping in the Gulf began to become a problem. And once the United States Navy and the Allied navies moved in, the Straits of Hormuz were almost closed. I, sitting in Iran, got panicky calls from the Ministry of Petroleum and from the heads of some of our oil companies, all of whom were public sector, saying, Mr. Shahid Affair, please talk to the Iranians, make sure the oil keeps flowing. And we want a guarantee of that. So I went to the Iranians and they said, oil flowing guaranteed, yes. Oil price guaranteed, no. So anyway, that is where that first crisis started. The 1990s thus highlighted the importance of energy for a now fast-growing Indian economy, and we began reforms. Private sector coal production, which increased substantially, reforms in the oil and gas sector, the beginnings of wind and solar, and energy efficiency was emphasized, so much so that it became an industry or a service of its own. 2003 to 2009 were the boom years of India. This was the era when the India-US nuclear accord was signed. India and the other BRICS countries were supposed to initiate a new world order by 2020 and so on. For us, that era ended with a global economic crisis, oil price escalation, and domestic scandals many of them, but coal in particular. This was also a period when global attention to climate change increased and Western pressures on India to conform to a new set of rules made by the Western rule makers, which we argued about, but we couldn't do much about. And then the issues we started with took their present shape: economic growth, climate and environmental responsibility, strategic autonomy, and energy makes up the quad of these problems. The story of India's economic growth trajectory to 5%, largest in the world, 3 trillion unknown, so let me touch on the others. On climate change, we have ceased to be on the defensive and have sought to be a leader. Under Prime Minister Modi and with both industry and public leadership of civil society, we have embarked on truly world-class expansion of green energy. We signed on to the Paris Accords, set our own nationally determined targets, the NDCs, set up the International Solar Alliance in Gurgaon, and so on. The target for renewable energy was raised from 100 gigawatts to 175 gigawatts. To understand this figure, please note that India's total power capacity is around 360 to 400 gigawatts. From 175, PM now in Glasgow has raised this to 500 gigawatts by 2030, out of a likely total of 820 total capacity. Which means we have to triple the present production of renewable energy, which today stands at about 165, of which solar is 59, wind is 41, hydro is 50, biomass and cogeneration about 10. The Prime Minister also committed India to achieving net zero emissions by 2070 and raised India's ambition to be among the leaders of what is called the green transition. Now, how do we go about this? We can marry the target of self-sufficiency to achieving net zero emissions by speeding up solar, including solar thermal and wind power, along with nuclear and natural gas. And I include both the latter two among clean energy. We will also need energy storage systems, electric vehicle infrastructure, hydrogen, and synthetic fuels, including from biomass for transport and our chemical industries. And this means massive opportunities for manufacturing industries of the future, but it also means massive investments, which is recognized, as well as new and more affordable technologies, which is less recognized, and they will create new dependencies not only for solar panels, heliostats, and electrolyzers, but also critical minerals, metals for catalysts, rare earths, and minor minerals whose names you may have never heard of, tellurium, cadmium, etc., which, if at all it is recognized, is not talked about in the public domain. The solar industry, basically solar PV, rooftop plants and so on, has been a real success story. We today have solar parks of 2,500 megawatts, which are among the largest in the world. But the constraint is that our plants are still based on imports of modules, panels, etc. And the industry is now facing difficulties in the switch to self-reliance. And we are also learning, like many in the West are, that the constantly repeated story of declining solar electricity prices, and now it is competitive with coal, etc., depends as much on China's mass production as on technological advance. Plentiful sunshine, however, makes solar an obvious option for India. And to be self-sustaining, the solar industry needs vertical integration like China managed, starting from processing polysilicon to making modules and panels and setting up the power plants using more Indian equipment. We also need R&D on new materials like perovskites, which can increase the efficiency of solar conversion of panels. That's a subject on which specialists will talk. I think we also need to start work on large solar thermal plants. We have a few, but we need to look at what is being done in Morocco and Spain and scale up. The wind sector in India can grow, and it's got a theoretical capacity of 300 gigawatts. The realistic capacity, which industry will tell you, is a fraction of that because of limitations of space and wind speed in suitable onshore locations, and the efficiency of our turbines, as well as what is called intermittency. Intermittency is a nice expression and usually explained as the sun doesn't shine at night. I like another definition of it, which is, why is renewable energy, like your dad or your granddad, depending on your age, favorite movie? Why? Because it's gone with the wind. So the wind sector needs domestic investment in materials for giant wind blades suitable for both offshore and onshore winds, as well as turbines, and this is important, permanent magnets for the high efficiency of running those. Energy storage systems, mostly batteries is what we are talking about, is a new subject which we have started off, and we are pushing it as hard as we can with a national mission. Just to give you an idea of how big the challenge is, we have today about 1 gigawatt hour capacity of battery storage. By 2032, we need 33 GWH. So just imagine the scale of the challenge. Brings me to another challenge, that is electric vehicles. Why? Because transport is not only a source of carbon emissions, but the pollution which is killing all of us. So ensuring a switchover from petrol and diesel to EVs is therefore vital. I'll give you a few figures which illustrate the size of the challenge. India has 1.3 million electric vehicles. It sounds great, but it is out of a total of 270 million vehicles in all. These are government figures. So penetration is less than 1%. In the two-wheeler segment, which is the fastest growing, the new purchases of two-wheelers, 5% are electric vehicles. And yet, our targets for 2030 are 70% of all two-wheelers will be EVs, 40% of buses, cars 30%. So we have a long and tough road ahead. But this is not a subject that is being addressed. Hydrogen also needs to be handled with great care. It is a highly explosive material, and the risks should be recognized upfront. This is not being done, at least in the public domain. I can expand on that during questions. Biomass or waste to energy is something we are now very proud of, with the use of ethanol for adding to petroleum. I would only caution that using grains or sugar for extracting ethanol is a diversion of food at a time of hunger, and it is wasteful of water in a water-poor country like ours. Using crop residues or waste is a better solution, but that requires more advanced enzymes than we now have, or new gasification technologies. There's something called high-temperature plasma gasification, which is already being used in India, but it has to be made affordable. If not, if we stick with traditional wastes, we are going to be stuck with what is called the NIMBY problem. The NIMBY problem simply is not in my backyard. Grid management is another technical subject which a lot of people are very interested in, and it needs to be tackled. I cannot comment on it beyond saying it is universally recognized as a key challenge, and it brings me back to the issue of base load management. In an energy poor country, you need mass base load capacity, and this means the continuing role of fossil fuels in meeting India's requirements for at least 3 decades. I will explain this after looking at the last 2 clean energy oppositions, which do not have intermittency or technological constraints. Hydro. Our hydro capacity has grown from 2.5 gigawatts at independence to 150 gigawatts today. Success. But we now know there's a huge social cost to this success, and maybe environmental costs too, which are yet to be calculated. We have seen some real disasters in the fragile Himalayan ecosystems. So I think we will continue on this route, but more cautiously. Talking about the Himalayas, I'm happy to see that we are now taking up geothermal in a big way in Ladakh, where it could be a really big difference. Nuclear, grown from 0 in 1947 to around 7 gigawatts in 2020. And we can be proud of the creation of a vertically integrated full cycle created by our scientists and engineers. But more recently, despite the promise of the Indo-US nuclear accord, growth has been slow because of cost factors public apprehensions, and problems created by our liability law. Recall that in 2005, we were hoping to reach 20,000 megawatts or 20 gigawatts by now. It must be stressed, however, that for reliable large-scale baseload, nuclear is the optimal solution if you want to get out of coal. And this I have seen firsthand in France. From 1970 to 2020, France basically solved its baseload energy problem by investing in nuclear. And it showed up the hypocrisy of the Germans when they said they were going to do Energiewende and get out of nuclear because they were importing nuclear energy from France. We need to step up our indigenous 700 megawatt reactors and find a publicly acceptable way to go beyond the Russians of what we have done with the Russians and start up projects with France and USA. But strategic autonomy requires us to go back to the vision of Dr. Bhabha with which we started, which is the three-stage plan. The first is your pressurized heavy water reactors, which we have. The second is fast breeders, and the third is thorium, thorium-based advanced reactors. If we manage thorium, we will have found the solution to two energy challenges: energy availability and access, self-reliance and security. What remains to be tested is affordability. But there's a lot of work being done on thorium now, and I think we need to be part of the international agenda on thorium. Fusion energy is sometimes talked about, and I won't go into it because it's so far in the future. All I'll say is that I'm very proud that India was the 5th or 6th country to join the effort, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor in France in around 2010. So I come back to a road I know best, which is fossil fuels and their continuing growth. The green energy options will change the future day after tomorrow and tomorrow, but you and I live today. And the transition, which will take 3 decades, we have to navigate. For others, it means navigation. For us, it means ending poverty. Even with increased electrification generated from renewables, our accelerating growth will increase coal, oil, and gas requirements substantially for at least 2 to 3 decades. Coal, we know, is the most polluting fuel, but coal is the foundation of our electricity system, and any coal shortage is the beginning of an electricity crisis. So we have to invest massively in clean coal technologies. We also have to find socially acceptable ways of mining enough coal in India rather than resorting to imports as we do because of political controversies and judicial intervention. I'm personally convinced more emphasis has to be given to natural gas as the bridge for reaching green goals by 2040. Remember, the United States lowered its emissions and gave China the gold medal, #1 polluter of the world, around 2008-9. How did it do it? It switched from coal to natural gas after the great shale gas revolution was unleashed. The problem of lack of support to exploration and production of natural gas in India has to be overcome, and the maximum possible increase of domestic gas has to be achieved. Otherwise, whether we want LPG for the poor, we want CNG for our vehicles, we want city gas, or you want gas electricity plants, or you want lower subsidies for fertilizers and food, none of this is going to happen. Oil is the lifeblood of the economy for all modes of transport, for chemicals for everyday life. Some of the chairs you're sitting on have chemicals in them, and pharmaceuticals. People have forgotten that even paracetamol is derived from oil. And for the defense forces, petrol, heavy fuel, oil, aviation fuel, depending on which service you are on, is absolutely critical, which is why I'm glad they keep focused on it. And never forget one thing. Diesel generators are the standby for all electrical shortages and emergencies in India and literally keep us alive. After I came to Bangalore, I discovered a new name, BESCOM. Why? Because the lights keep going off. We in India, not the government, people like this, the housing society where I lived, have put in place 90,000 megawatts 90 gigawatts of diesel generating capacity. That is equal to our solar and wind combined at this point. Never forget this. This is something which energy people never talk about. Studies by the IEA in 2020 showed that even in the best case scenario for energy transition, in 2040, India will consume even more than the 5 million barrels of oil per day that it consumes. Should we risk continuing to be dependent for 85% of our oil on foreign sources? For our defense, when we are facing two enemies on our borders, I shudder to think of what another crisis that leaves the almost streets closed for just 2 weeks would do to us. The current oil market turmoil in India reflects our failure to produce more oil. This government started with the luxury, I say this, the luxury of oil prices from mid-2014 when oil prices crashed. And much of its economic agenda has been achieved by continuous petroleum tax increases. I won't burden you with the figures except to say that something like 25% of your indirect taxes come from every time you go to the petrol station what you fork out. The oil import bill will now soar higher than 130 billion of last year, and there will be increased trade deficit. Our current account deficit is reaching 4.6% of GDP, mostly because of oil. And the continuous pressure on the rupee will continue. And mind you, other countries are lecturing to us about buying Russian oil. We can manage now, but soon the entire world will depend on a smaller and smaller number of oil producers if the green activists actually shut down oil production in the West. So strategic autonomy needs a step up in domestic production of crude oil, and we also need to increase our strategic reserves from 2 weeks to around 3 months. The domestic oil and gas production sector faces unimaginable challenges of extraordinary taxation and regulation. This is one area of abject failure of the present government led by Prime Minister Modi. I will leave it during question and answers, but I'll just mention one fact. Do you know that in the oil industry, probably the only one that faces this problem, you pay something called royalty to government for the right to produce oil. The GST department says you're paying royalty as a service, so you pay service tax on royalty. I find it hard to believe. Coming to the end, public leadership, my last 2 points, I promise you. Public leadership cannot in the 21st century be left to political leadership. Government obviously has the first role, it must provide laws, regulations, etc. But civil society and think tanks like Synergia have a role in creating public support for the compromises necessary for energy production and distribution, access and affordability. Obviously, industry has the greater responsibility to implement best-in-class practices for minimizing environmental impact and making local communities stakeholders. The exploitation and production of any natural resource, whether it's lithium for green batteries or oil, must start with what is called an end-of-mine plan, which is the producer must work ahead on reducing environmental impact and say up front that he or she is going to restore the areas where mining was done. But mining cannot remain a synonym of quasi-criminal activity as it is today in India. And I think we need to be able to do that in organizations like this. If we continue on the road we are finished, because the global scenario is truly selfish and based on selfish considerations. So I'm coming to my last point, and that is life, L-I-F-E. That is lifestyle for environment, according to Mr. Modi. The world has to act on the belated recognition that saving the planet through the green option can work only on the basis of climate equity and justice in sharing the remaining carbon space left for the planet before 2050. The latest IPCC report, I haven't gone through it myself, but I've seen commentaries on it, shows how far we are still behind on this. One of the conclusions it comes to is that if the planet has to remain 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than pre-industrial levels in 2050, countries like India must stay at 20 to 25% of the GDP and energy consumption level of the West. That's called equity, by the way. Are we ready to accept this scandal? Our PM, as I said, has promoted lifestyle. I think we need to be a little ruder. We need to ask who created the mess we find ourselves in, and how do we end poverty? Reread the script of our Prime Minister at the world's first environmental conference, 1972, Stockholm. International Human Environment Conference. Two heads of government chose to attend, the host and Mrs. Indira Gandhi from India. And she went there and said, poverty is the greatest form of pollution in this world. So my answer to the questions listed in the title would be, yes, if we implement drastic energy reform at home and get a new global compact on technology and resource management. Whether either is likely, I will tell you next time. I will conclude with a quote from Mr. Barack Obama before he became president. A country that cannot control its energy sources cannot control its future. Thank you.